Good afternoon, viewers of the Greater Caribbean. It is indeed a pleasure to present on UWI's PhD graduate series on UWITV. I'm indeed honored to have been given the opportunity to present on my research, which I submitted in February 2021, entitled Trade in Live Music Services between European Union, French Caribbean Territories, and Anglophone CARIFORUM countries, the case study of Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. So before we get into the meat of this presentation, for the benefit of those of you who may not be familiar with trade jargon, I would just like to give you a few definitions on what is a service and the four modes in which services are traded. So you hear the term live music service, but what exactly is a service? A service is an intangible product that usually requires intellect or energy to be produced. Services include air and ground transport, banking, telecommunications, etc. However, in the case of the live music industry, services include live performances or a music producer producing songs for a live music artist, an event manager organizing a festival, concert, etc. So there you have an idea of what a live music service is. So there are four modes of trade in services as defined in the World Trade Organization's General Agreement of Trade in Services. And these modes are cross-border exchange, consumption abroad, physical commercial presence, movement of natural persons, and, well, that's the last mode, movement of natural persons. So regarding mode one, cross-border exchange, this refers to trade through the use of technology. So therefore exchanges via the internet and satellite and cable would constitute cross-border trade. And in the case of the live music industry, a pay-per-view platform streaming a live music event is an example of cross-border trade. And just as similarly, ticketing platforms like Ticketmaster, where patrons buy virtual tickets to attend a live music event overseas, that would constitute cross-border trade in live music services or cross-border exchange in live music services. Relative to mode two, consumption abroad, this refers to trade in services where consumers travel to consume a service. So tourism, when tourists travel from one country to the other, that would be seen as consumption abroad. And relative to live music services, concert goers who travel from Europe to attend live music festivals and events in the Caribbean, that would constitute consumption abroad. That would be an illustration of consumption abroad. Mode three is with respect to physical and commercial presence. And this simply means that one has the right of establishment. Therefore, like a St. Lucian producer who sets up a studio in Martinique so that Martinican live music artists can purchase his service, that would be an example of mode three, commercial presence or the right of establishment. And mode four is the movement of natural persons. This simply refers to live music stakeholders who travel to deliver a service, touring essentially. Therefore, when St. Lucian, Stoker, and Dennery artiste Moto traveled to Paris in 2022 to deliver a live music performance at an event organized by a Guadeloupean events management company that constituted movement trade, live music trade happening by the mode of movement of natural persons. And now that you have, and when I speak about live music stakeholders, I'm speaking about the live performers themselves as well as those who directly support live performances, such as the producers who produce music for the live music artists, as well as the talent scouts, the managers, the promoters, or events managers company, and the like, the DJs, etc. Okay, so now that you have these definitions, these key definitions in your head, I'll move on to a little icebreaker where you're going to learn a little bit about me and my relationship with uh, live music. My relationship with live music began from childhood and has progressed to adulthood. At age 19, for example, while pursuing an associate's degree program in tourism management, I requested to do my internship at the Dominica Festivals Commission to help them organize their annual World Creole Music Festival. At least that was what it was called at the time I had done my internship. And my boss at the time was Mr. Jeffrey Brisbane. Jeffrey, if you're listening in, hi. And I remember working alongside with Lady Ophelia, who was described as the grand dame of music in Dominica. So, Lady Ophelia, if you're there, I'm saying hello as well. I remember working alongside her and her having gifted me a CD of one of her latest albums. So, thanks a lot, Lady Ophelia. Um, it was really in Dominica where I became immersed in French Creole music. It was there I became familiar with musical genres such as compa from Haiti, zouk and zoukla from Guadeloupe and Martinique, cadence calypso from Dominica, and bouillon from St. Lucia. And I was also exposed to zydeco from Louisiana in the United States because of this internship. And since then, my interest for music endured, so much so that while I was a postgraduate student in France, I attended live music events with my friends, as seen in the photos on the slide. Here we went to see a French reggae band, Dub Inc. or Dub Incorporated. And the last photo shows the crowd response to their performance. And it's proof positive of the crossover appeal that Caribbean music has in Europe. Here it is. You have a European band singing Caribbean music, and it's getting this kind of response. And not only did I frequent a great deal of live music events while I was a postgrad student in France, I was also a backup singer for a jazz, not a jazz, but a soul funk band in France, in Lyon, France. And I'm going to give you a little snippet of my performance. I am in the white jumpsuit. Here we are during rehearsal, so please don't judge.
You like your face something, baby. I don't believe you find a woman. I don't believe you find a
All right, so you've seen the snippet of my performance. So now we move on to what motivated me to pursue this research. So, what motivated me to pursue research on trade in live music services between EU French Caribbean territories and Anglophone CARIFORUM countries? Well, firstly, I thought that live music is an integral part of international relations, with possibilities for it to be used as a form of soft power diplomacy. And I delved into this in great depth in my peer reviewed book, International Trade and the Music Industry: Live Music Services from the Caribbean, published earlier this year by Routledge. And here I spoke about the possibility of the Caribbean using the export of live music to bring attention to its priorities of sustainable development, climate change, poverty alleviation, and reparatory justice, and reference South Korea's K pop model as a template for the adoption of this initiative. And notably, the United States Department of State launched in September, few, in 2023, their Global Music Diplomacy Initiative. And one of the aims is to use music as a form of soft power diplomacy to deepen the US's engagement with international publics and export US values globally. Um, Another reason I chose to do this research was I believed that live music trade can support economic diversification in the region. This is because it is an economic juggernaut for contributing to the world economy, as is now further borne out by the impact that Taylor Swift's Eras tour and Beyonce's Renaissance tour has had, well, both of them have had on the economies of the United States and France. There are reports that Beyonce's tour also helped boost the economy of France. And closer to home, my interest in this study was also motivated by my desire to help youth from the Caribbean, specifically urban and rural, indigent, at risk youth, who are often heavily involved in the music industry but may not have the resources or network of contacts to export their trade internationally as the well established live music stakeholders. And many would agree that it is often the Caribbean youth, particularly those in underserved communities, who are who can be described as the engine room of Caribbean music, of creating different musical genres. Genres such as reggae and hip hop were the creations of Caribbean youth or those belonging to the diaspora in the global north. I mean, we have Jamaican American immigrant DJ Kool Herc, who is credited as having been the brainchild of the beats associated with the genre of hip hop. Um, and then you have also here in Trinidad and Tobago the new genre known as Trinidad music, which has regional appeal, as well as Dennery from St. Lucia, which is also created by the youth within the Caribbean. So these are just examples. Even the steel pan emerged from a young man from an urban, underserved area in the early 20th century. So these are just but a few examples. So another reason I pursue this research as well is because of the existence of the EU CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement. And this is essentially a trade agreement between the European Union and the CARI Forum, i.e. CARICOM countries, 15 Anglophone CARICOM countries, and Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. And this agreement was signed to facilitate the creation of a free trade zone for the exchange of goods and services between the two regional trading blocs. The agreement was first signed in late 2007, early 2008, and has commitments pertinent to trade and entertainment services, inclusive of live music. And these commitments are of particular relevance to live music services providers of the CARICOM who wish to expand their market access to the EU, inclusive of its overseas Caribbean territories. And the same can be said for music stakeholders of the overseas French Caribbean territories who wish to increase their market access to CARICOM countries and their diasporas in the global north, in North America and in the UK. So within this agreement, there are provisions made to encourage non-commercial support of this trade, and these provisions are outlined in the agreement's protocol for cultural cooperation. And these non-commercial activities outlined in the protocol include intercultural exchange activities, reciprocal pro bono concerts in the respective territories, etc. Another reason I chose this research, what motivated me to pursue this study, is that since 2010, Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago have been laying the groundwork to promote this kind of trade following the signing of the CARI Forum EU Economic Partnership Agreement. And there have been successive trade missions since 2010 between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago, and even Trinidad and Tobago and Martinique, with the purpose of seeing how this trade could be developed. And I also pursued this research too because I believed that I possessed the required skill set to do it and to see it through successfully. I knew that for this research to be successfully completed, the researcher would need to be trained in international business and trade and in research, as well as have fluent proficiency in English and French. And I believed I met the requirements prior to my being awarded the PhD degree in international relations from the University of the West Indies. I lived in France for a period of 7 years where I successfully completed 2 master's programs. One of my master's degrees was an interdisciplinary professional degree in international business and foreign languages from the University of Lyon. And the other was a research master's degree in information and communication sciences from the University of Grenoble-Alpes. So based on my credentials and my experience and my training, I believed I would have been able to carry out this sort of research. Now we move on to the next slide. So what is the problematic? What is the overarching problem? Well, based on anecdotal accounts from cultural and trade experts in both territories, and the live music stakeholders from both territories, it would seem that since the signing of the Economic Partnership Agreement, that trade and live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago are low. At least this was the finding when I conducted this research. I spoke to a senior trade operative of the Regional Council of Guadeloupe, Emily Susaram, who indicated to me that she believed that prior to the signing of the 2000 prior to the signing of the Economic Partnership Agreement, she would see the presence of more CARIFORUM performers to Guadeloupe than is currently happening. And in speaking to live music stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago, specifically the emerging artists, they have said that they've never had opportunities to tour within the EU French Caribbean. And so, based on this anecdotal account, these anecdotal accounts, I believed that the volume of trade was low between these two territories with respect to live music services. And in addition, I also looked at the royalty inflows between the two territories when observing the data between SASEM, which is the collective management organization of Guadeloupe and France, and COT, which is the Copyright Organization of Trinidad and Tobago, collective management organization of Trinidad and Tobago. I noted that the royalty inflows between the two territories, especially with regard to performance rights, where live music would be a subset, was, negligent since the signing of the Economic Partnership Agreement. So, based on this, I wanted to understand what factors impacting on this trade. To be able to conduct this research, I set up, I how should I say, I defined the purpose and objectives to be able to conduct this research within an empirical context. And so, move on to the next slide. So, the purpose of my study, therefore, was to examine what were the factors determining live music trade or impacting on live music trade between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. And the factors which I examined were demand, technology, geographic proximity, trade facilitation, legal institutions, and culture. And the objectives of my study were as follows: to empirically ascertain the volume of trade in live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago, to determine which factors had the most significant impact on this trade, and to identify the factors having a positive or negative influence on this trade. So, given the time constraints, I would not be able to go into why I chose all of the factors or all of the variables, 7 variables for the study, but I will discuss a few of them. I chose technology for obvious reasons. Music, the music industry, and music, the way music is exchanged and traded, has become increasingly dematerialized. And we see that by the proliferation of pay-per-view e-platforms to see live music events. We also see that through the returns made by streaming platforms such as Spotify and Apple Music. So this had to be one of the variables I included within my study. In terms of culture, I thought this one to be very important, given the fact that Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago share cultural commonalities in that they both endured European conquest and colonization. They had also the enslavement of Africans, as well as East Indian indentureship. And this historical cultural these historical cultural similarities between the two territories are borne out by the similarity in terms of festivals, both Trinidad and Tobago and Guadeloupe celebrate Carnival. In addition, there are carnival characters that are common to both territories. And the use, of course, of mud and paint and blue paint, the usage of that during the carnival masquerade, those two territories share that commonality. In addition, there's that commonality in terms of celebrating the festival, the Hindu festival of lights, Diwali. And even in terms of the folklore, we share similar folklore characters, which we heard when we were, small, like the Sukunya and the La Chablesse and Papa Bois and Le Lagaou. So there you have those similarities, but yet, despite these cultural similarities, there is this whole gap relative to the language, with Guadeloupe being a French-speaking territory and Trinidad and Tobago being an Anglophone territory. So how would this impact on the trade? Would the language difference be so powerful that it would minimize the other cultural similarities that the two territories have? And how would this impact on the trade in live music services between them? And then in terms of the geographic proximity variable, I saw this as important because both of them, both Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago, are a mere kilometers away from each other. They're both in the Lesser Antilles. Yet when you take a plane from Trinidad in the morning, you arrive in Guadeloupe in the late afternoon, evening. So, and it's because of the long stops and long layovers. I mean, this was what occurred while I was doing my research. This was the case. Maybe things have progressed differently, but this was the case. So dealing with that transportation issue was really necessary to look into within the context of trade in live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. In addition, when I looked at the geographic proximity variable, I did not look at it in terms of the physical geography, simply through the lens of physical geography, but also through the geopolitical prism. This is because Guadeloupe, by virtue of being an overseas territory of France, is a part of the European Union. I mean, they even have a presence in the European Parliament, the French overseas territories. And the European Union is a powerful regional economic trading bloc, which is comprised of several countries with large central economies, developed central economies. And because of this, they wield a great deal of influence in the world. And I looked at it versus Trinidad and Tobago, which belongs to the CARIFORUM, which is comprised of a group of small developing states with small peripheral economies who do not command a regional bloc which does not demand the degree of influence that the European Union has on the world international stage. And I wondered how this would tie in to the trade in live music services between the two territories, especially when it went, especially in the level of negotiations of the actual agreement, who benefits more, who benefits less. So my conceptual framework, the chosen conceptual framework for this study was a modified version of the Linda hypothesis, also known as the country similarity model. The Linda hypothesis is premised on the idea that similar countries trade more. Therefore, the principal hypothesis in my study was this: the more the two countries are similar, the greater the volume of trade in live music services. And the secondary hypotheses were as follows: similarities in demand, similarities in legal institutions, similarities in technology, similarities in culture, and the like, as we go on, have a positive impact on the volume of trade in live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. And as you see in this diagram, the volume of trade in live music services is the dependent variable, whereas those in orange are the independent variables. So when Linda developed this hypothesis in 1961, he believed that sociocultural contexts, as well as historical contexts and socioeconomic contexts, have an influence on the degree that two countries trade. But he stated that above all variables, similarities in demand are the most significant in determining the volume of trade between two countries. I was attracted to his model for the simple reason that I had looked at many other models created for the creative and cultural industries, such as the Throsby model, the Cost Disease model, the Kia and UNESCO model. And I found that though they were very useful for examining the ecosystem of cultural industries, they were not pertinent to looking at bilateral trade between two countries. Similarly, I also looked at other international trade models, such as the Heckscher-Ohlin model and the technology gap models, the Vernon model, and the gravity models. But many of them were not pertinent for the study of live music services trade, because the thing is, for a service like live music, live music does not operate with the level of predictability that other services industries operate. And you needed a model that would allow a researcher that understands the music industry to select variables that would be really key and pertinent to the study of trade in live music services. So yes, I've covered, I hope I haven't forgotten anything as yet. So we move on to the next slide. So here you see a visual representation of my research design, which essentially functions as a roadmap of the methodology I applied to my research. The first step of this research is the country similarity model framework, and this is the conceptual framework that anchors the rest of the study. As we discussed in the previous slide, the hypotheses were established and the independent and dependent variables were established. So we move on to the second step. And of course, here the Linda model is the chosen framework. All right. And on the next step, which is relative to data collection. At the data collection phase, I recruited or surveyed 61 live music stakeholders from Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago to source primary data on the 7 variables. And the instrument which I used was a survey, which I administered in English and French. And the survey was structured on the 7 variables and the 4 modes of trade. I also used a Likert like scale of 1 to 5 to integrate it within the survey. This way, it allowed participants to register how much they agreed or disagreed with a statement, seeking to find out how a variable was impacting on trade in live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. So one represented strongly disagree and thus indicated that participants felt that this variable had a negative impact on this trade, whereas 5 represented strongly agree and thus showed that participants felt that a variable had a positive impact on this trade. And 3 represented the midpoint or average. In the third step, here you would see that data was transformed and thus yielding comparative aggregates for Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. And they served this data as descriptive statistics, which would provide more context to the results emerging from regression analysis at the stage of inference. And the transformed data was also used in measurements and processes for verifying sampling adequacy and survey reliability, such as the Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin measurement and Cronbach's alpha. And of course, the data was also used for exploratory factor analysis purposes. And in the fourth step rather, following the extraction of the model through exploratory factor analysis, I then applied methods of regression to extract a confirmatory model, which would explain what were the variables having the most significant impact on live music trade between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. And lastly, the fifth step required that the results from regression were analysis triangulated with the comparative aggregates for Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. And this was done so that the results from regression analysis were given more context through the comparative aggregates. So what were my key findings? Yeah, I know everybody loves to hear this part. So results from regression analysis showed that the volume of trade in live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago is low. And this was consistent with the data from the comparative aggregates for Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. Live music stakeholders from both countries have concluded that the volume of trade is low. So therefore, the anecdotal accounts were confirmed through the empirical study. Following methods of regression, in terms of the variable of geographic proximity, this was shown as a variable which had the most significant and positive impact on this trade. However, this differed from the results from the comparative aggregates for Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago, because they showed that trade through this variable was trending in a negative direction. And when digging deeper into the aggregates, one sees that the high cost of air transport, the many stops and long layovers, as well as the lack of availability of flights, were areas that were undermining the positive and significant impact that the geographic closeness between the two territories ought to be having. So, yes. Following methods of regression, technology was seen to have had a positive and the second most significant impact on this trade. However, once again, the comparative aggregates for Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago showed differently. Live music stakeholders from both countries believed that it was having a negative impact on this trade. And when delving deeper into the aggregates, one sees that this is because live music stakeholders are dissatisfied with their technology infrastructure vis-a-vis their high-speed internet services. And they also bemoan the fact that technology is being underutilized for cross-border trade. Example for the use of having e-platforms to facilitate cross-border trade in live music. And that result was understandable because through while doing my research, I found out from the Secretariat of the European Commission based in Barbados, there's a trade directorate. And through that directorate, they informed me that cross border trade in cultural services like live music is not permitted within the Economic Partnership Agreement. So this is indeed regrettable given the increasing dematerialization of services, all kinds of services, and particularly music. So yes, moving on to so following methods of regression, it was seen that trade facilitation is having a positive impact on this trade, albeit the impact is not significant. It was seen that trade facilitation is having a positive impact on this trade, albeit the impact is not significant. And these results are consistent with were consistent because I already submitted my findings in 2021. So these results were consistent with the Burienda's 2019 report regarding the Economic Partnership Agreement and the Chai 2 report also regarding the Entertainment Services and Economic Partnership Agreement. However, the comparative aggregates differed from this result. It was seen that live music stakeholders from Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago have rated the trade facilitation measures which have been implemented thus far have negatively impacted on this trade. And when digging deeper into the data on the aggregates, one sees that live music stakeholders have concluded rather, that the trade facilitation measures, which were inspired by the Economic Partnership Agreement and its protocol for cultural cooperation, are not being adequately implemented. And these include the fact that, well, at the time I pursued the research, perhaps things have changed since, but these included the fact that artist registries of the respective countries are not mutually accessible in the other's territory, and the fact that the Economic Partnership Agreement has not worked in minimizing the geopolitical differences between the two countries, and the fact that there are no B2B trade events between the two countries for the purpose of facilitating this trade. I have noted, however, that recently Caribbean Export has been organizing networking events for music stakeholders within the Greater Caribbean. So there seems to be activity to be able to assist in the development of trade between the Anglophone CARIFORUM and the EU overseas territories within the Caribbean. Okay, following methods of regression, in terms of the variable of demand, demand was seen to have a positive impact on trade and live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago, but it was not the most significant variable, and therefore it challenges the Linda hypothesis, which states that Above all variables, similarities in demand are the most significant in determining the volume of trade between two countries. In terms of culture, well, this one was a shocker for me. Following methods of regression, this variable was seen as having a negative impact on trade and live music services between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. However, this result differed from the comparative aggregates for Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago. Live music stakeholders believed that it was having a positive impact on this trade. So, when studying these aggregates, it would appear that the language differences between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago have had the impact of minimizing the positive effects that all the other forms of similarities in culture are having on this trade. And following methods of regression, legal institutions were seen to have a negative impact on this trade. When I speak of legal institutions, I'm also referring to legal frameworks. And this is no surprise because the comparative aggregates show that live music stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago have a negative view of the administrative functions of their collective management organization when compared to those in Guadeloupe, who have a somewhat more positive view. So this was not. So those were the findings of the study. Okay, so now we're moving on to the recommendation section. So in my dissertation, I listed 20 recommendations to develop trade and live music services between EU French Caribbean territories and Anglophone CARIFORM countries. And I even listed recommendations for exploring trade in live music services between other regions, for example, between uh, Louisiana and Haiti, as well as Quebec and Martinique, as well as the English speaking Caribbean and Africa. Um, Also proposing the use of my research model and methodology to be able to conduct a similar kind of research regarding these territories. But returning to what I recommended for, in the case of live music trade between Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, I gave a list of 20 recommendations, which I subdivided in accordance to each of the 7 variables. And I provided extensive details on how these recommendations could be implemented, but cautioned that before implementing them, empirical research should be done first to test their viability. Perhaps have an innovation lab to test to see whether these recommendations would work before implementing it across the board. And also in my book, International Trade and the Music Industry, Live Music Services from the Caribbean, I provided further recommendations on how conditions regarding the 7 variables could be improved to develop not only South-South extra-regional trade, as is the case with the overseas French Caribbean EU territories and Anglophone CARIFORM countries, but also North-South trade, extra-regional North-South trade. That is the Caribbean and Europe and North America. And I made these recommendations by going into great deal about the South Korean K-pop strategy to raise the possibility for the implementation of that South Korean strategy. So, in terms of the variable of geographic proximity, I made the recommendation that the air bridge needs to be improved between um, the two territories and between all the other territories within the Greater Caribbean. And I'm heartened to see that there are discussions on improving the air bridge. Recently, in mid-October of this year, uh, the Association for Caribbean States held a seminar for the purpose of discussing how to improve connectivity within the Greater Caribbean. So discussions are going, and hopefully we will see results soon. Uh, in terms of technology, I spoke of the need to revise cross-border trade arrangements in the Economic Partnership Agreement. This is important because, as I alluded to earlier, cross-border trade in cultural services such as live music is not permitted within the Economic Partnership Agreement. I understand that the agreement is due to expire soon, so perhaps if there is a new agreement between the EU and the CARIC Forum, that nations could focus on somehow implementing the trade in live music services, cultural services via the mode of technology, which is cross. So, given the dematerialization of cultural services, very important. Okay, relative to trade facilitation, I recommended that partnerships between cultural associations of Guadeloupe and Trinidad and Tobago to brainstorm on trade facilitation initiatives. So, in terms of demand, I spoke about the need for empirical market intelligence studies on the viability of diaspora markets for increasing demand for live music. And I went into details about this in my thesis, but I went further in my book, International Trade and the Music Industry, Live Music Services from the Caribbean, when I referenced how South Korea was able to use its K-pop music strategy to increase demand in global north markets. And I presented this model used by South Korea as an option for the Caribbean to explore in increasing demand of its live music services through the use of the diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, because South Korea used its East Asian diaspora